Good idea.
All right. Well, for those who missed it, we don't have something as fancy as the admin podcast. We have some elevator music with a Dungeons and Dragons clock countdown and an invalid formula. Not use date literals in your formula fields. Just a reminder. Hello, everyone. My name is Nate Pepper, and you are here with the Los Angeles Salesforce Developer Group. First virtual meetup in a while. We actually have not had an in-person meetup since February 2020. So if you have any
Oh, wow.
Yeah, if you have February 3rd, 2020. COVID happens. It was like, push it off a month. So if anybody has any venue ideas, offer up some office space or, a local pizza place or whatnot, that is a good idea for an in-person meetup. We do want to get butts and seats again and, schmoozing together, and it's long past overdue. So drop me a note, put it in the chat, reach out, hit me on my DMs or whatever, because we are looking for an in-person event, hopefully by the end of the year, calendar year.
Nice.
Cool.
With that, I think, let's make sure that, so Joe, in order to, if we introduce our speaker for this evening, from Thunderyard Solutions, who I work with on a current project. We've got Joseph Lopilato, and he is going to share his experience with Lightning Web Component controllers.
That sounds good.
Much more, let's see, any administrivia? I guess if anyone is anyone hiring, can open the floor to have someone make an announcement if anybody's looking for Salesforce developers or anyone to join the team. Anybody want to take the floor a bit and make an announcement? All right. If you missed this chance, just post it in the chat. Also, if anybody's looking, feel free to post that. There we go. Booz Allen Hamilton's always looking for good talent. Exactly. We're looking for a DevOps engineer. But I'm not sure if those have been filled already, but do reach out. I know that our project is looking for, or at least was looking for, a Salesforce developer and a DevOps engineer, probably a few other roles. So reach out. And with that, Joe, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you. So first thing I wanted to ask, just to judge and gauge where people are with Lightning Web Components, because it gets deep. There is a lot that has been built on there in the last couple of years. So just so as a general kind of understanding for you guys, like, how many people have built Lightning Web Components? Are you familiar with, we can get kind of into the weeds right away, but there's a lot of really interesting techniques that they're using, like inheritance, composition, slotting. I was hoping we could touch on some of that today. We'll do a brief touch on, I figure we'll start with some of the more simple stuff and then try by the end to really start to build into these very interesting concepts like dynamic templating and things like that that actually they provide in certain scenarios. So I'm just going to pause for a sec and ask, does anybody want to offer any sort of experience or anything that they've built or are familiar with, or if they're brand new, just so I kind of have an idea on where to start. Nathaniel, if you're talking, you're on mute.
So I'm a certified administrator, but I don't have any paid experience yet, and I'm trying to do what I can to establish a career in the ecosystem and trying to learn what I can.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's great. So the first thing I'll say about Lightning Web Components is when you move from something like Flow, some sort of administrative, something that you can do with clicking, especially things like screen flows and stuff, you are stepping way, way out into kind of an managed terrain. And the important thing to when you're working and designing kind of components or doing anything of this sort, the best suggestion I can give to you is make sure that you can't do it in flow, in screen flows and things with invocable Apex and stuff like that. Because once you move into Lightning Web Components, one of the biggest things that you have to deal with is something called state management. And what state management is that's how the UI looks compared to the memory state behind it. So for example, if I click a button and that button click causes some sort of effect. Now, what happens is you have to maintain some sort of data model in the back in the controller to save that state, to know where it is. And there's a lot of times when you add multiple buttons to a screen, let's say you have a save button, a close button, and a couple other things, what happens is there's the user can click different things in different orders, and you have to make sure that you've handled and captured all of those states and the traversal of the different states, whether the modal is open, the modal is closed, all of these different states that you're dealing with. What Flow does really well is they actually kind of pull that state management away from you so that you have a lot, you can rely on them to handle that very, very hard complexity and you don't have to deal with it. And like one of the classic examples is there's a component called the lightning spinner. I'm sure you guys have seen it before. It's the little thing that spins like this, right? Well, one of the classic examples is, let's say something comes back from the system. Let's say there's an error in your Apex somewhere, or something's down, or there's something broken. If you only expect to get the happy path data back, what happens most of the time, or a lot of times I've seen with developing, is that spinner stays up the whole time and it doesn't come down and it looks confusing. Users don't have any feedback on what went wrong. And so some of the goals that we try to do is to mitigate those sorts of those like failure states and unhandled exceptions, things like that. We'll talk about some of the strategies today, but those are that I would say the core of LWC. What it gives you is it gives you a lot of flexibility. It gives you the ability to build things that the Salesforce ecosystem didn't necessarily anticipate that are hard to do in Flow. But the trade-off is you are dealing with a lot higher complexity in terms of state management. You're going to be maintaining the code. There's fewer people. It's more expensive. There's fewer people out there that are available who will have the ability to fix these things. And so therefore it becomes a higher level of effort to actually implement. Now, when things need to be done in the LWC, they need to. So you have to move to it. It's good to know. But that sort of gap and that trade-off is a really kind of important thing when we're talking about what, like the difference between using Flow versus LWC. Now, when you're starting with LWC, the first thing I want to say is like your tooling is really, really important. And so the first thing I would say is there's something called the local development server, which is a super, super useful concept or tool that I want you guys to be aware of. I will paste the link in the chat. And what the local development server allows you to do is it allows you to start to develop your front-end components completely independent of any backend. No Apex, nothing like that. So you get much faster turnaround. It monitors changes in your code and reloads them automatically. There are some gotchas with installing it that are important to know. You can have Nate reach out for me if you guys are stuck. It's pretty easy to get going. So I highly recommend installing this, using it, getting comfortable with it. It's really simple. We're going to demo how this works today. But it's going to save you a lot of back and forth time when you're actually doing development, and that's really important because you're going to be refreshing constantly. So we want to try to mitigate how much you're actually refreshing in the system.
Especially if it's on a page layout of a detail and you click a tab and click into an accordion component to get to your thing.
Yeah. And we'll show you how flexible this drill down can be. The other thing that's really, really awesome about it is you build what I like to call like container LWC that basically stub out the server provide fake data and pass in parameters so you can test your components, and you have basically, you build your own little test environment. So we've actually used that at AIE to help build some of the harder components that we have. So for example, we have like a very complex address component based off of requirements that we have. And what we did is we built a whole Lightning app that has all of these inputs that plug right into the to the component, so we can test it dynamically. We can load it up in the development server, no problem, stuff like that. So it gives us a lot of speed. It gives us higher accuracy of development. The faster you move, the more you can do. Generally speaking, the better the stuff will be. So I highly recommend this. I'll show you some of the techniques that we have here. The second tool that I really want you guys to be comfortable with and familiar with, and we will demo what it can do today and some of its power, and that is the dev tools that are built into Chrome. Okay, so these dev tools allow you to do debugging. I'm going to show you how to use the console down below. There's some really, really clever stuff you can do with that. And it allows you to drill way deep into your Lightning web components. So when you're debugging, I mean, I've seen this actually with a lot of devs, and people don't know about how powerful this is, what it can do for you, some of the caveats with it. And we can talk a little bit about configuration and settings so that you guys can see, you know, like how would you actually go about setting this sort of thing up. Okay, so those are the two core tools you're going to need besides just VS Code and kind of your standard development stuff. Now, the third thing I want to talk about is style. So one of the important things, and one of the like really, really big things we've had to work with, is JavaScript has a lot of variation. You can do a lot of different things in a lot of different ways. So when you join a team, you know, and you're working with a team, what's really important is you guys develop a shared style of code that's really easy to understand. We want things to be clear. And the reason is when you're developing LWC, you want to be able to peer review it really quickly. So style is incredibly important to communicate your ideas and to communicate any complexity you're dealing with in a clean way so that people can read your code, people can maintain, you know, the stuff that you're working on and help you with some of that stuff. Hold on one sec. I'm going to turn this light on. So those two ideas, or I'm sorry, the idea with style is really, really, really important. Now, when it comes to like a good source of truth for style, like where would you go to learn about, you know, how to write JavaScript in a good way? The best resource I've actually found is something called the Airbnb actually keeps on GitHub JavaScript style guide. You know, as you're learning this stuff, this will be something that you go back to, right? It is a resource. You're not expected or should try to just read this and memorize the whole thing. It's about when you're working through your problems, you're figuring out what is the best way I can express this complexity. What is the best way I can, you know, communicate this? How small, like how little of code do I need to use this? JavaScript has a lot of really, really useful functions built in. So oftentimes when you're building like for loops and things of that nature that you're used to doing in code in languages like Apex or Java, things like that, JavaScript will have tools and functions and things that you can use that'll do a lot of the data manipulation stuff that you're used to doing by hand. And so the goal is often to do what I like to call like one-liners, right? You want to figure out ways to do one-liner sort of things that before would have been really complicated to do and implement. So this is another resource I'm going to drop in the chat for you guys. And you can see it's quite long. Okay, it tells you about variable naming, properties, everything that you could imagine about how to like deal and work with JavaScript. It's here, and they have a lot of amazing examples. So that was a lot of information up front, quite a bit. So I'm going to pause for a sec and just, you know, see if does anybody have any questions, thoughts. I'm going to drop these links in the chat really quick. Oh, it's Ben. Question regarding the LWC local development. Standalone components, but does this allow you to import the existing customization and declarative resources in an org? Okay, that's a really good question, Ben. So when we're dealing with local development, one of the things that's really important is your LWC naturally has an interface that sits against the server and retrieves information from the server. So what we want to try to do when we're doing local development is build these container resources that provide fake data or stub servers. And it takes a little time to get set up. So, you would use it more when you're dealing with high complexity stuff than low complexity stuff. And you take the time, you stub out any of the calls out to Apex that you have. You provide some fake interface for them, and I can show you some tricks for that. And then you run your local development. So you try to keep any of those dependencies to your server out of it, so you're just working on the front end on its own. Any other questions about that sort of stuff? So that was a good one. Let's see, maybe touch on this with local dev server. Do you steer away from touching S objects directly? That's another good question. Yes, and I'm going to show you guys some tricks. We can jump into that right away. Would JavaScript to be the overall main best programming language to learn for the Salesforce? Now, that's an even better question. I would say no. I would say probably 80% of all of the UI that you guys would ever need, you could build in Flow and in ScreenFlow and leverage open source libraries for good Flow plugins that would keep you out of LWC. JavaScript it's tricky to do well. It's honestly not even the recommended language anymore. It's better to use something called TypeScript, which is a little bit more complicated and harder to learn. So I would say it's much better to get your Java chops up on the Apex side of things. I think that's more valuable long term. But I do think once you understand JavaScript and functional programming in general, right? There's two different types of programming that you learn in the Salesforce ecosystem. There's what's called like object-oriented programming. That's what Java does. You have class names and stuff. JavaScript has a little bit of that, but it's more core functional programming. And the way functional programming works completely changes the way you develop. It changes the way you think. And it's really, really good to learn, but it's a much higher bar and it's a higher expectation from you. So that's the trade-off. The other thing that's really important to talk about JavaScript is it is not statically typed. And what that means is you can have any variable be of any type. So unlike Apex, where you have to specify integer, what the class name is, if it's a string, JavaScript doesn't have that sort of thing. And so what you'll see happen a lot of times is if you're not used to programming in JavaScript, it's hard to understand how to deal with unexpected values. Undefined slips in a lot. Null slips in a lot. Maybe it comes back as string. Maybe it comes back an array. How do I handle this complexity? And one of the big challenges that the JavaScript ecosystem has discussed and dealt with is how to deal with that, especially across larger teams. Statically typed languages across teams are a much, much cleaner, safer implementation. So we'll talk a little bit as well about how to handle some defaulting and some catches to kind of protect your code from those sorts of unexpected parameters that get entered in and things like that. Because you will have them, I promise. Even today, we are planning on filing a defect with Salesforce over their LWC engine because they're not expecting an undefined parameter coming in and it's blowing up one of their functions. Okay, that was a lot. Again, I see there's a lot of text-based questions, so I'll just keep popping back in and I I think that's all of the stuff that I wanted to talk about on, there's one other tool that I do want to talk about. Now, this is one that I'm going to give you a caveat to. And the caveat is, make sure if you're going to use something like this, that if you're going to use it, like I do not use it at AIE, I use it on my own time for experiments and things. But one of my favorite tools, it's a more modern one, is GitHub Copilot. And it's about $20 a month, but what it is going to allow you to do is it's going to speed up your overall development speed by about 20 to 30%. And a lot of the gains actually from that tool are not on the programming side. Your function writing will help you a little bit, but it's probably 60% accuracy on function writing. But the other piece that it really is going to help you with is documentation and data creation. So let me show you kind of what that looks like. So I have a really simple project here. Got a lot of different interesting techniques that we can talk about. We have this panel component, right? And just kind of going back into, before we get into some of the true LWC techniques that are available to you and what they might actually allow you to do, that's really fun. Before we get into that, I do want to show you this kind of concept for the LWC, the local server where we're stubbing data. So what I have here is a parent component. You can consider it some sort of container, like a test container that has, it's really simple. But what we have here is we have a data file from JS, okay? Or it's a JS data file, and it's got a bunch of fake stub data that we're actually bringing into the parent component or container to pass into the things we're testing. So this is a really good way to use this data file to pass in fake data. Now, when we're looking at how I generated this, one of my favorite things is how actually this is where Copilot's really useful for things like this. Test data, it's amazing. So for instance, if I just press enter here, you'll see if I start to type a new one and give it some sort of, hold on, give it some, should go here, it'll actually start to auto suggest values for you. And you press enter and tab, essentially to just tab through, useful pieces of information. So it has some really, really helpful things to spin up test data incredibly fast. So that's another thing that I really like to actually encourage people to take a look at, because that's going to speed you up quite a bit. Now your test data, you're not typing all this stuff in immediately. You're getting auto-suggested information and then using it to speed up and create higher quality components. Does anybody have any questions about that little piece I demoed there? That's a really powerful thing. Nothing.
Where's
Cool.
the attributes sub-object?
Attributes sub-objects. If you wanted to, you can, but let's dive into kind of some of the basic structural things that we have here and look across all of these different components, what we're doing. I don't even know if I'm using this one. No. Okay, so we have here an account panel, a message panel. This is kind of, I burned another warning for you guys that I hit, which was pretty nasty, is I burned the capital O. So the LWC engine is built off of Node.js, so it is type sensitive. So if you do a capital and then you change it to a lowercase later, it gets confused and you'll actually blow up its whole deployment system and stuff. So be careful. And that's what happened here, and that's why we have opportunity panel 2. Okay, so we have a generic panel here, right? So I'm gonna kick open the LWC server now. So Command-Shift-P or Control-Shift-P on a Windows computer, and you can see here we have this preview component locally command. That's the one we're going to want. So we're going to press enter. We're going to use the desktop browser, and we're here into the local development server. One thing that's really nice about this is it is rip fast on most like modern computers. This will speed it. This will reload really quickly, and it's monitoring. You can see right here down in the output, it is actually monitoring changes that you make. Every time you hit save, it's going to go back and refresh whatever you've been working on. Okay, so we have this really simple thing. It's a generic panel. And the part that I want you guys to see about this, okay, so this is really standard. You'll see this when you create any sort of new LWC component. You have a class called panel. It extends lightning element. That's very standard. We can talk about the concept of API just really shortly. And what the concept of API is each of these LWC components is its own class. It's its own, literally, it's its own class. And so what the API decorator allows you to do is it tells the system that both record ID and editable are available to other classes to come and pass information in. So those are the access points that we're providing from the panel to other things that are going to use the panel. And I'll show you some really nice examples of how these can be used. But right now for this, the concept of a panel is we're going to pass in a record ID and we're going to pass in some concept called editable. And then we have a getter, read only, which is just using it's using this exclamation point to flip it. So you have two different ways of thinking about the editability of your screen. You have editable and read only. Really simple stuff. Now, the first thing I want to show you guys is the concept of inheritance. And just like in Apex, you can actually use inheritance on your components. Now, this is something that I really want to caution you here. The point of inheritance isn't to build some super long multi-depth chain of inherited things where it goes all the way up through 10 classes. That's really not the point that you want to get to with this stuff. You want to keep these pretty lean and mean. But for example, if you are dealing with any situation where, let's say you have 5 panels that you have to create an LWC and you want them all to share some aspects, that's when inheritance is a really good thing. We can create a generic panel class that maybe has some parameters and it has some, some functions that are shared across all of your derived panels. And then you get this really, really, really nice clean system. We're defining things once in the panel class, and then all of the children that extend that class will get that. So any questions about that generic or like that concept? Because that is pretty abstract.
I had a quick question about that. In a personal project, and I'll type this in the chat as well afterwards so that I can post the chat on comments of the description of the video. So I've got C that is generic and does all the heavy lifting. It's a chart.js thing, right? So it does all the, hey, like give me the base object name, give me the child object relationship. But then on the extended LWC, I want to have a drop down of like which fields to slice a pie chart by, right?
Mm-hmm.
What's the difference between in your extended LWC? In the markup, you could just go C hyphen, base LWC and pass those versus extends, capital Pascal case thing, right? And inheriting those attributes.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So when you are dealing with composition versus inheritance, so the first thing you were talking about is composition, right? I've written one component, I want to pull it in, versus I have an abstract component and I want multiple variations of that abstract component. So in the case that you're talking about, what happens is you actually have to control the interaction between the two components that you have. And there's a couple ways to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and switch to an example of composition that we have so you guys can see. So I have here, this is one of my favorite little widget components that we've built over at AIE. It's really simple. But what it does is it has essentially this HTML, and you can drop it in and use it in other places. So for example, I have it actually in the account one here. So you can see here we have this idea of a message panel that we're dropping in and using. The difference is the message panel itself has, and I kind of want to diagram some of this out, but the message panel itself has attributes. It has its own collection of parameters. It has its own methods, things like that. But what's different about inheritance is the following. So let's say I have what my abstract panel component, and all of my different panels share a couple functions and attributes. When I use composition, so let's go to the parent component here, and let's take a look at this. This is where it's magical, because here in opportunity panel and in account panel, they both have this editable component or this editable attribute available based off of that inheritance. So I can define a collection of attributes that both of my children components will have available to plug in. So it kind of powers, it supercharges your composition, because typically what people do, and I've seen this a million times, is if you wanted an editable, like an editable attribute across like maybe 2 or 3 different things, you would define it here and you would define it here in your account panel. Like so. So you end up with, let's say you want to, like a really good example of this is how maintainable, or how this actually adds to like your maintainability cost. But let's say you have your 5 panels and you've written the APIs, the API attributes for each one 5 times. So you have editable written in 5 different places. Now, let's say I want to add a second parameter because of some new feature I want to bring in. Let's say we want editable, and let's say we want to have some function, or like, I don't know, some color, right? If I don't use a little bit of inheritance and I don't recognize that shared component, if I want to add color, I'm adding color across all 5 different places. So I have to make 5 changes in order to include that color attribute. With inheritance, you can define up in the panel, and I really recommend just like one level, but you can define something up here. We can add your color attribute. And then when you're using any of your components, suddenly in the parent component here, I can now set the color of both of these. So I've reduced my overall footprint change by 1/5 because of that inheritance practice. That's the power of that piece versus composition, which is I have a concept that I want to reuse in a bunch of different places. So for example, with the message panel, what we're using here, we want to have messages show across the whole UI. Then I'm going to want one message panel component that shows the messages, and then I can drop it in a bunch of different places. Does that kind of make sense?
That made sense to me. Yeah. And I put a link to a Stack Exchange answer about somebody asking a similar question with the render portion. But yeah, it doesn't inherit CSS. It doesn't inherit HTML. It inherits JavaScript shape, for lack of a better term, right?
Yeah.
But also the functions, right? If you've got a spinner in your base component, it doesn't inherit Lightning spinner markup, but it inherits is spinning or whatever, is loading, and then the on-click functions that will turn on or off your child component's Lightning spinner markup.
Exactly.
Nice.
And that's one of the best things. Now, one caveat to it is you're right, it doesn't inherit HTML or CSS. But one thing that is cool, and I do want to bring this up, is you can actually still use and define an HTML for your abstract if there's some use case for it where it's not the derived version, and then you can use that as well, right? Almost like a virtual class, where even right now, if we're previewing the generic version, it's got its own HTML. If that has value outside of the derived versions, you can use that one as well. So that's something that's really powerful too. All right. So the next thing I want to talk about is Nate, what you're Actually, hold on. Let me check something here because I don't want to go out of order. Okay, yeah. Let's talk about some of the simpler implementation things before we get into these big heady concepts some more. Because there's a couple that I want to hit, but I do want to hit some of the simpler classic things first. Okay, so the next thing is this concept of a getter and a setter. Right, so the point of a getter is it's essentially a dynamic value that is derived from another value, so or set of values. So here with our read only, if I would ever go and ask for the value of read only, it's going to go ahead and calculate this piece for me automatically. Now you can use this to really, really great advantage if you have settable API values that then drive the rest of the state of your application. And let me show you what that kind of looks like. So here in our message panel, we have this core API value called variant. Now variant has 4 different kind of modes for it. It's got success, warning, error, and info. So the way this works is when I pass in a new variant value, the system will detect that the variant has changed. And once that change event fires, LWC actually in the background will take any of the functions that have a dependency on your variant and recalculate that information for your getters. So when I change my variant, I know I want to change a couple different things. I want to change the class list. I want to change the alternative text. I want to change the background. I want to change the icon name, and I want to change the icon variant. So my single publicly exposed parameter will force through 5 different changes that I want to make. In a typical scenario, you would usually monitor the change here and then actually go in and set them, one by one in some sort of function. And say like if the variant has changed, like think about triggers. If the variant has changed, then do this, then do this, then do this. Okay, that's kind of the way it works. Getters make that a lot simpler. And the way they work is they automatically in the background are detecting for changes. And then if a change happens, it forces all of the getters that have a dependency on that variable to recalculate, and then it refreshes your UI. So what this allows you to do is it allows you to have really quick refresh loops for any sort of UI that you have. And that's a really powerful thing. So let's go ahead and just preview this component so we can see it. It's not much on its own. I'm going to actually pull up let me pull up something that's actually using it so we can see it and play with it a bit. Okay, so you can see here we have this message panel. We're passing in a variant called error, right? I'm going to pause on these guys for a second. And let's go ahead and preview this. Okay, so you can see here, right, we have this really simple idea, right? Now, I'm going to go ahead and you could imagine, just for the sake of this demo, just imagine I haven't done any of this dynamic getting, but this is exactly how it works. We're just going to do it through the dev server instead of like a user changing the value. But if I change this to info, let's say, what happens is it's going to detect that calculates, and it's going to change the color, right? You saw this whole thing refresh because it's the dev server, but that same sort of concept happens. So your API values represent the inputs that then drive the rest of the state of your system as best as you can. And so you can have, one single variable that's causing all of the change of state of your LWC just push through. And that's a really, really great pattern. I highly recommend people practice that and get used to it because it is really, really important. So looking at this chain, right, you have this concept where you have API values that are set by somebody else, whether it be a user action, another component based off of server information. And then you have these getters that automatically calculate their state and then force a refresh of the component. So that's your chain as you're moving across, and that's how you get your UI to actually change dynamically. Now, I'm going to add another step in there. And the step is, what if before let's say a user comes in and passes in a value for that API, what if I want to take that and do something to it before I push the rest of my getter changes? Let's say you are expecting an array, a collection of things, and I want to reduce it down into a collection of words instead of objects or something like that. What do I do in that scenario? And that in that particular case, let's say you want to massage API data before you let it force a refresh on your screen. That is the second piece that we have, or the second tool that JavaScript gives us. And that's called the setter. So let me show you kind of how a setter works and what you would expect to see. So here we have this API accounts, right? We expect the accounts to come in. And you can see we have this getter driving off of our API value of accounts. So when the accounts change, we're going to use this mapping function to return a collection of account names that, it's really simple, really easy, but then we're going to display the account names. So let's go ahead and go into the account panel and see how this works. So you can see here we have dynamically computed attribute unique to this component. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and preview this. And let me make sure, since we don't have any defaults, let's go ahead and add some defaults in just so you can see, right? So when you set something early like this, when they first construct the account panel, it's going to be account 1, 2, and 3. And then if a user comes in and changes it, it'll detect that change and then force the refresh for our getter. So that's pretty standard. So now if we see this should, I forgot to do, hold on. Let's use objects. You can see again that such a nice feature to have that suggestibility for test data and stuff. Okay, so now if we jump back into this, you can see here are the names being dynamically set. Now, let me give you an example of something where we would want to control the user flow on accounts before we actually let it run through our getters. Okay. So you can see here, right? What if they pass in our information out of order? So you have this API exposed for the user. They're gonna pass in an array. And I'm gonna give you 3 different edge cases that are problematic for this. Edge case 1, what if they don't pass in an array and they pass in a null value? It blows up. We open up this inspector. You can see here we have uncaught and promise. It gives us it drops in the exact piece here. You can see the getter fails. And I'm going to show you a little bit of the debugging here that's really powerful. So I'm going to press the breakpoint here on this, and then I'm going to force the refresh on the screen. Okay, and you can see it jumps right back into this getter. So at this point, looking at this, and LWC doesn't do a great job of making this. There's a couple caveats to inspecting that are a pain in the butt. One of them being variables are hard to read. But if I look at this, I can see that I'm on this line, and I want to figure out why this would be causing a problem. What you can do actually during your breakpoint is this console is live. And what I mean by that is if I type in this, I actually get a reference to the class I'm in, which means I get a reference to all of the variables I have. So for example, let's look at this editable. You can see that's undefined. Okay, that's good to know. So no one set this. We also can see that this .accounts is undefined. Okay, so I haven't stepped any further, but I can inspect what my variables are. I can look at the state of everything as I'm stepping through my debugging. That's an amazing feature. Next, why would this fail? So let's go ahead and actually step through and we can actually take this line here and invoke, our actual test. If we wanted to, pause it, take a look at what it would do without actually executing it. And you can see you get this uncaught type error, cannot read properties of undefined reading map. And so you can see one of the first danger points with API values. And this is where JavaScript is really sketchy. We have this entry point into the state of the LWC component. And what's happening here is you can see right away, we do not have control over what other people or other components or anything are passing into the state of our system. And the way these functions work is like a dot map assumes that we have an array. If you see, if I type in even just down here as an example, a really simple array constructor dot map, you'll see it'll actually provide the function reference for what that map is. When I have an undefined thing and I try to access array functions, I get a problem. So that is a really nice way of me telling, okay, so I don't have an array. So you can see there's this necessary step, like precursor, before I actually fire all my getters to control state, where I want to do something with this accounts variable. And that is where the concept of a setter comes in. So the way I like to handle setting variables and like building setters and getters and setters is the following. So usually you will see an underscore. And actually, one thing that I did to learn a lot of this was I read some of the recipes for the original Lightning Web components that are available in GitHub and started learning the style from them. But you can see the underscore just represents an internal variable. It's not going to the HTML. You're never going to use an underscore here. It's internal to your controller class. And that's how we distinguish these types of variables. You never decorate them as API. You'll see functions done this way as well. So I'm going to provide an internal state variable called accounts as a default. And this is going to represent my kind of internal accounts state. And then I have my external API variable called getter for accounts that people can actually use to retrieve the internal state. So this is going to just, when somebody asks get accounts, it returns our internal state. And then I'm going to include a setter, the value, and this is going to be where I actually control. So when somebody comes in and sets it, you know, this would be the typical thing, right? Like this is equivalent to the state before, where it just sets it to whatever it is. But now maybe I want to have some protection, so I can add in an if statement. So one thing that you can do, a really quick and dirty way to figure out if something is an array or not. Arrays are tricky, but the first thing you can do is use this exclamation point, and I want to show you what this is. So the not just here, what does it does something in JavaScript called Booleanize. So it takes something, it takes a variable of any type, and it turns it into a true or false. And you can see how this actually works. One, again, coming back to the console, I can show you kind of how some of this works. So let's look at a Booleanized version of a clear array. So an empty array fails the Boolean. Undefined, you know, that's going to be true. So it's saying it basically flips whatever it is. So an empty array is considered a legitimate value. Undefined will turn this to true. So you can use it to detect if this is undefined, set a default. This is kind of like how you would set up like a setter with a defaulting structure to protect the integrity of the state. You can see here again, Copilot's dropping in really nice comments to include or to improve the clarity and quality of my code. I'm describing a lot of this stuff. And then let's look at null. You can see that null also hits that. I can't remember if an empty string does. Yes, it does. So an empty string resolves to that. I believe 0 resolves to this. So you can see there's a bunch of default states across your different types here that you can use to check, but it will never ever let an array through. The other thing, I don't recommend using that one for arrays. I recommend using this one. You can see here, you know, this is another way of doing things, but depending on the type, this will catch, I think, 90% of the different values that you'll have coming in. So when you're looking for arrays, I would always use isArray. Okay, but for like strings, other things like that, this other exclamation point's a good way to do things. So we're going to check if it's an array or not. So array.isArray value, and then set that, and then finally pass it into accounts. Awesome. We could also do something else. For example, let's say we always want to have our private state be in a sorted state, right? We never want to allow unsorted information into our system. What do we do? Well, again, in our setter, which happens, this is the first basically input control that we have, is we can call a setter, or we can call a sort now that we know it's an array. So then we could say value.sort, and then finally do our assignment, which will, again, strip everything out and clear things up. So if we come back to this, where we have, let's say, like a collection like so, let's pass in that. You can see again when I render. Okay, so that when this is paused, it won't force a re-render. So you click the button up here to resume execution. And let me go ahead and refresh this, and you can see there it is. So let me check that. That should be sorting. Oh, that's a silly thing. The reason this isn't sorting is, you have to actually provide the name value, but it doesn't matter. You would put it here, let's say, or you would go and iterate through the map and sort them. So it doesn't matter, but the concept is the same, right? Like when you're using a setter, it's to control the input and that sort of thing. Okay, that was a lot. Does anybody have any questions about getting and setting, or is this pretty standard, straightforward for everyone?
I had a question. When you were hitting the this.accounts.map, accounts was undefined. I guess what would be what would you say to someone who goes, "Oh, I'll use the question mark." I don't know what the name of that is. Safe navigation operator is what they called it when they put it into AVEX. Like, oh, okay, well, if it's null, then it won't try to access .map of the undefined or null thing. Is that a smart thing to do? Is that a safe thing to do? Or is it going to end up giving you hard to detect, error states?
I think you know the answer to that.
I fooled you.
But you can see here, right? Like even just testing, right? What I love about console is you can just type these concepts in and see. So the return value, when you use the safe navigation, it doesn't throw an error, even though this is undefined.
Yeah.
But it doesn't return the function either. So if I provide some sort of function-based thing for this, oh no, that's cool, it works. I did not know
give you an
that
error, but it doesn't give you the result you want.
List either. Yeah. So in that case, there's something else we can talk about. This is called safe navigation. We can talk about default values. So in the case, sometimes like when you're dealing with getter states, there's often the case you don't have good control over whatever's getting passed in, right? You don't, the setting is too much. You don't need something that complicated. You just want some sort of default state for your getter to fall back on in the case that something goes wrong. And that you can just use this, which I love. You say or that. And so this is actually a way of defining a default state. Here. So to your point, if you have something like this, what should happen is we should get back a single I there. So that's a way of delivering a default state back in a getter in a one-liner. That's really nice. So I love that little trick. Any questions about that? No? Nobody? Okay, everybody's good. Just as like a general kind of question for everybody, is this stuff that's new for people, or is this, I mean, if anybody answer would be helpful, but is this stuff new for people, or is this, pretty well understood territory that we're in? Because we can jump into so much more not so new. Okay, good.
I'd say for me, it's a good balance. There's some stuff that I know and follow, and then there's some new tricks. So this is like spot on.
Okay, cool. Great. Not too weedy. I like that. All right, so the next thing we need to talk about besides getters and setters, right? So we understand the idea of setting, controlling our input variable, like, controlling default states and things for us, providing default values and doing any actions that we want to do on our input information before we actually have it push our state through. And we've talked about providing safe defaults using the OR, talked about dynamic type conversion setters, and then, okay, so let's go into actually interacting with servers, which is a little harder to demo on the LWC side of things, but I can show you some basic examples. Just out of curiosity, does anybody here know about the concept of callback hell? Is that new for anybody? Has anyone heard that term?
You're referring to the it's not a sideways pyramid. Are you talking about like the nesting of nesting of nesting?
Nesting of
Yeah,
nesting.
I think it's a pyramid.
The pyramid, yeah. Okay. So then I'll just throw this out there. How do you how did JavaScript, I think it was a while ago now, but how did they end up resolving or fixing callback hell?
Non-empty promises.
Non-empty promises.
I was just going to say promises.
Yep.
But even the promise, right? Because you have in a promise, but promise alone doesn't solve it.
It's a lot of callbacks still.
And you can get in a then hell, right?
Yeah, because let's look at like a typical promise sort of thing. So this is kind of one of my good questions that I like to think about. But let's say, so you can see here, look at this, it's amazing.
Wow.
Okay, so let's say we have an async function that returns a promise, and let's call a function synchronous. Async consumer. Okay, so this is going to call this dot async function dot then. And we love all this dot catch. Okay. So if you use a traditional, and you'll see this actually in a lot of examples and things, I like to pull it over here. But within this async function, if I was to call a secondary async function like this, I'm doing this, aren't I?
Mhm.
We still get into the same pyramid thing. So the promise itself doesn't actually solve this.
Oh,
There's
you
a
can just return
different
it.
thing.
Return async.
You can flatten it that way. Yeah. You can flatten it that way. Yeah. I prefer, well, here's what I would say. I would use what I recommend doing if you have this type of behavior where first I do one asynchronous thing, let's say for an example of an asynchronous thing, I want to go get data from the server and then bring it back. So that typically is, it's going to call that function. And then once it's been resolved, it comes back and then I can handle that. Or if there's an error, I can do something. So if you have to chain these things together, and examples of chaining might be, I need to load one thing from this area of the server, and then I have to call some other Apex function after, whatever. That's what Kyle's already on it. Yeah, async await. So what async await does is it actually flattens the structure for you, and it makes it look more like a typical thing. So you can see, you add this, sorry, I don't even remember where it goes. I thought it went there, but
I don't think you need the function keyword here in the LWC.
oh yeah, that's what it is. Thank you. I don't know if you guys do this, but I'm used to using this this version. Anybody seen this function definition style before?
All the time in React.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, I was going
So
to
this
say,
is
not
the
in
one.
LWC.
Yeah, I like doing it this way. That's why I'm like, I don't know how to do the other way anymore. Okay, so the way this would work in a try catch now is you can use await to essentially do the same thing that your promises would do. You can see here, right? This is again the concept. So this is a locking. This is locking. So what it does is it says do not continue execution until whatever has happened has been resolved. Now, I do want to talk about this a little bit because this concept of locking that JavaScript has, since it's single event loop, like it's got a single event loop, is really kind of interesting and important. So let's kind of unpack what that means. So if you see here, we have this value like await this async function. What it's going to do is it's going to pause execution of this function. Now, what's the scope of that pause? And what I mean by that is what's actually pausing in JavaScript. Is it pausing the whole system? Does it pause just the execution of this function? What goes on in that pause? Anybody know off the top of their head?
It would just be within this function.
Yeah, good. Who is that?
Kyle.
Kyle. Hey, Kyle. Yeah, you're right. Exactly. So what we don't want to do is we don't want to lock the overall system, so it will pause the execution of this function. Meaning, if I am using another, like let's say I have a different function running and it's going to call async consumer. If I run it like this, this is going to say this is going to finish execution before async consumer finishes. So await is this async await concept is it only one layer deep. It will only pause the single function and then everything else will happen. So if we can call it asynchronously where everything past this point can still run without it being finished, then we're good. If we need to pause this one too, you have to start chaining away and this is again where that callback hell still remains a little bit. Now we need to have an await here as well if we want to pause this top function as well as the async consumer function and everything inside of it. So it's better, but it's not perfect by any means. Anybody have any questions about this concept of async await?
In the async await model, is there an equivalent to returning promise.resolve without doing anything?
Without doing promises.
Like if I was using promises and
Like resolve all?
resolve all, or if my function sometimes is going to run its async logic, but sometimes it's not going to do anything, but it still needs to resolve, so I can just return promise.resolve. Does async await have an equivalent?
I don't know if it does. Do you know? Is that like a question you have an answer to?
No, I'm not asking rhetorically.
Seems it's like such a great little edge case. I feel like you would go Google that one. That's a good question. I don't know. I would honestly, in those sorts of scenarios, I fall back on promises.
Okay.
That's a good one though.
Maybe it just returns. I don't use this model much, so that's why I'm asking.
Yeah. The other thing I like to do, and I highly recommend as a good pattern with async await, is to have some sort of state variable that you save locally like this that controls some sort of loading state. So here you usually use a lightning spinner, and then you provide that. And whenever you're entering an async consumer, one thing I really like to do, you fire it off here. Then when you're try catch it finally, in the finally block, you set this dot loading to false, which will always prevent this will always prevent the loading state from getting stuck in your async consumers. If you use this finally block, it will always fire no matter if there's a try or a catch error that happens. Okay, so that's a nice pattern. I've seen is loading a lot, loading, whatever, just name it simply, but you drop it in at the very beginning of whatever call out or asynchronous function that you want to do to display to the user that they're in some waiting state, and then you flip it off in the finally block. It's pretty clean. Another thing that I do want to talk about, so I think that's pretty straightforward. Everybody seems to understand this stuff pretty good, which is awesome. That blew up. What I do want to talk about is something maybe let's talk about. And that is slotting. Does anybody know about slotting? This is probably the most advanced thing we'll get into today.
Do you use slotting?
You use it?
Mm-hmm.
Nice. Which type? Default or named?
Use both.
Okay, cool. So when you're using them, right, the kind of core one is the default slot. That's like the basic piece that you have. So for example, if you wanted to have, let's say, some content, and I think this message panel is really the perfect example of this. So here in our message panel, we want to have some content that's provided dynamically. We can pass in anything we want, and then we're going to style it. We're going to do a bunch of stuff to it. We're going to control its containers look, control its padding, everything like that. So you can use a default slot, which you will see on this line right there. And so when you put in a default slot like this, it looks like this in a compositional sense. And that is right outside of the declaration of the head. In the end, you can drop in any sort of information that you want. So go ahead and look at this. Right, so the point of this, and this is where I think it's really, really important, and Kyle, I'm sure you guys do this, but the goal of this is to find ways to take components that have shared functionality or requirements that are shared functionality, especially across the system, and expose that UI in a way that is reusable. So at your org, if you have every single dev defining some different way of displaying error messages or information messages and stuff across the screen, I'm not sharing the right one there, but if you have, so you can pass in, as you can see, like complex HTML, it gets dropped into that slot and then automatically stylized. So what this solves for is things that need to be shared or framework components that all of your dev team is going to be using. You want to be like, if you're a tech lead, Kyle, like if you're in that situation, I'm sure you do this now, but if you have different components that are displaying messages, error messages, if they're displaying information messages or whatever the thing is, and each one's implementing their own variation of that, you're gonna have a lot of problems. You're gonna show your overall UI state is gonna look weird because you don't have a consistent user experience across everything. So this reusability, where you take a slot and you plug in any information into it, that's going to be a really, really helpful thing. So things like error panels, info panels, you can see we've abstracted it into a single one that has different states. So we can stylize this in different ways. So like a warning here. So it gives the ability for a dev to come in and just write, use the message panel for any variant that we need. And now we have a consistency of display across the system. So now the other type of slot is when you have a more complex thing. So if you want to slot multiple things at once in a single component, let's say you have like a header, a body, and a footer, for example, and you want to style each one differently. You'll see this with like a lot of typical implementations of modals, stuff like that. That's when you use something called name slots. And the only difference is with a name slot, you just have multiple slots and you provide an attribute called name. You can see that here. So we have a slot name called success, and we have a slot name called warning. Okay, so when I call or I drop any information into either of these slots, because they're within the message panel default slot here, it's going to pass up and stylize one as a success and one as a warning automatically. So this is using kind of both in composition so that you can actually pass in a bunch of stuff. So for example, you'll see this guy up here doing that. I'll just pause this one. I think I lost what it was. Hold on. Yeah, oh well. We'll just do it real quick. So you can see here, right, like in between these two, we can actually just access this. So we just create a div. We're going to pass it into the success slot. And we're going to have a div. We're going to pass it into the warning slot. Okay. Blow up. Did I forget something? I don't know where the error is. Oh, there you go. There you go. So you can see here, I think it's not showing, probably because I have the wrong names on these. Anybody help? But if not, you know, there's something small and subtle that's wrong, but that's the basic idea behind it. Any questions about this, like for you know, slotting and kind of what it's used for, why you would use it? I would recommend, as like my favorite technique with slotting is a dynamic single slot. Have you seen that that one before? So if we go to Lightning recipes, this is, I think, one of the most interesting uses of the slot. So the one edge case with slotting that I want to talk about that is really powerful, and this is like something that, you know, I really think you can use to great effect, and it's how they handled something like lightning tabs. So if you take a look at like a lightning tab implementation here, this one's pretty cool. The way this works is you have a single tab, and then you have your collection of tabs that are automatically generated. So you can see here in this example, they are using a default slot. We don't have any naming of the slots. We don't have anything like that. You can see that this actually drops in really nicely, and you have your three things. So what's magic about this is the parent knows about the children that have entered the slot, and based off of that, can actually dynamically display header values based off of other things that exist within the content. So it's detecting the elements within the slot and then actively, or not, and then actively, it's probably, then actively detecting it and then showing that information. So in order to achieve something dynamic, so we did actually use this at AIE, this concept to build a wizard, or not really a wizard, but like a dynamic app. So we wanted to have this the same concept of tabs come across and then display content and control visibility with a single component. So the thing is, what you're trying to do is you're trying to have a single component here that is aware or able to detect a dynamic collection within its slot. And the way you do that is a technique that actually is available to read about in the implementation of this. I'll drop a link. I have to go look it up, but it's a really cool thing. And since Kyle, like you're one of the people here that obviously has a lot of experience with this sort of stuff, I really want to turn you on to this technique because it unlocks a whole new door for you as like building wizards, building these like dynamic components that are really cool. And so the life cycle is essentially this. When you drop a new child component like a lightning tab within the lightning tab set, on the connected callback, when it's actually added to the DOM, you fire a registration event and catch that registration event on the slot in the parent component. So for example, in my default, like, here we are on the opportunity panel. Again, you guys are very comfortable with this stuff, so I'm going to take it into a little bit more of a complex environment. But here you can see we have this single slot here. Well, you can have an event that you capture, like let's say on child registration. Maybe you have a better name for that that's specific. And so what this allows you to do is it allows you to say, when the child connects to the DOM, it's added in and rendered, it shoots an event up to the parent through the on registration event that you do. And then you take that and it provides, the child can actually provide information to its parent about what its name is, what order it's in, any sort of information, if it's visible or not, if it has any defaulting things that it needs to do, what its status is. And so you can have these registration events bubble up from your children and then provide that content rendering dynamically. So now what happens is within your slot, you have all of the different pieces that you've added dynamically, and the parent knows about them and has references to each one. So you can control visibility with those references. You can you can hide them, you can show them, you can do all this really cool stuff. And so that would be the one piece in slotting that I don't see anywhere in documentation, but it is in code. So I do want to bring it up because it's a really powerful technique and it's pretty cool. So I will shoot out the recipe that's using it so you guys can read through it and kind of get your handle on like what's actually going on there.
And question,
Yeah,
Joe, on child registration, is that an out-of-the-box event, or is that something that you would write in the parent or something?
You would write that in the child.
Got it. Okay.
And then kind of what you would expect to do is, let's see, what would the child be in this case?
But that
let's say it's the message.
handle child registration, that's a function that you're writing in the child. But that on child registration, is that an out-of-the-box?
No, that's not. That's a custom event.
Okay. Just making sure.
So you'd say like dispatch registration, and then you would just do new, I can't remember off the top of my head, but something like this. Right. Child registration, fire off the custom event with any state. And then in the parent, let's say it would be like something like account panel or opportunity panel or something like that. Here, it's going to actually grab that. And then you'll be, if you look at, let me show you like what a function would look like in this case. But this is pretty cool because in your handler, you actually get, what you'll see they do is they have children, like some sort of children list. And then when you get this handler, you do this dot children dot push, and then you use event dot target. And that actually gives you a reference to the child element, which then you can do, let's say you wanted to hide all of your children, you could run like a, something like this, which is really great. So this dot children dot for each child, let's say there's a method, an API method on the child that's available. You can do this. You can iterate through all of the implementations of your children or all of the registered children and hide them all. You can do really cool stuff on that collection. It's all dynamic. So it allows you to put as many different things as you want within your single default slot. You use this registration event to track them, and then just make sure that you have a deregister event on the disconnected callback as well in case they go away. And that allows them to, what your users will end up doing in that sort of scenario is similar to what Lightning tabs can do, which is you might have a template directive on the outside here that shows or hides one of these tabs dynamically. Let's say you have something like this and it's going to hide one of those tabs, and then it flips on, it flips off, and it's dynamic. If you have a register and a deregister event, it's going to actually know that and pull them out, and then you can update, let's say if you have some sort of headers or something, you can write a getter to then take those children and as long as you are good with here, I'll show one. There's one caveat to this that we can bring up. But let's say if you have your headers here, right, you can return this .children.map. And then you can display those headers dynamically in some HTML in the front, right? And then you have a list of them. So it's really, really cool. This actually won't fire. This getter won't fire when this registration event happens to refresh the DOM. And I don't know if anybody ever gets caught with this one, but this is like one of the classic gotchas in LWC. This when this function runs and it actually modifies this, it will not force a refresh event. Does anybody know why?
Not tracking.
So when this runs, this handle child registration event runs, it's going to take the target element that came in, it's going to push it into this array, and it's going to run this hide across them. So this will run fine, but the overall UI of the panel, let's say if you had some headers across the top that are dynamic or something, those actually will not refresh. Does anybody know why those don't refresh?
Is it because you didn't decorate it with track, or because
Yeah.
you're not setting it with an equal sign?
Either.
Or both.
Yeah. Do you know why the equal sign works? And then do you know why the track, I think, is pretty obvious. So that's their workaround. So what he's talking about, for anybody who's not familiar, there's this decorator you can use on variables to say, hey, watch this and watch if it changes, so that it forces a refresh event. So this is like the simplification of that. But the underlying reason why that needs to happen, does anybody know what's going on and why that happens?
Is that because kind of like const, when you declare a constant, if you make it a string and then you make it foo and then you try to reassign it to bar, it knows that you're reassigning it. But because it's an array and you're pushing, it doesn't detect that as a reassignment. I don't know, am I off?
Mm-hmm.
That's all I had.
It's not that, because you can reassign it, right? Const locks the assignment, so you can't change, but you can still mutate the record. And Ben, I'm just seeing your question here. I'll answer that in one sec. But in this case, right, there are two different ways that you will be able to work and change data in the state of your component. The first is reassignment, and the second, and that's what Kyle brought up, and the second is mutation. So the difference is, when I have an array, that array actually has, within the system, has a pointer representing to a place in memory where that array is. So when I reassign a variable to a new array, I am changing the memory location of that variable. When the memory location changes, that's when the observation out of the box will fire. So if I do what Kyle says, if I take this and I clone, this is a nice way to clone arrays, and I clone this array, what's going to happen is it's going to create a whole new array with a new memory address, and then it's going to assign it. And that assignment will change the memory location, which will trigger out of the boxes to fire without track. If I mutate it, and this is an example of a mutation, another example of a mutation, you'll see a lot of different array-based functions that have this. Sort is a mutation. It mutates the array, but it doesn't change the memory location, which out of the box will not fire a refresh. So a lot of times people get confused. You're working through this stuff and then suddenly things just stop refreshing or whatever. And that's why. So if you have to force a refresh, you can either reassign or you can use the track variable or the track decorator, which will then cause it to track any changes within that mutated variable. I will say I've not had the best success with track. I don't know if you've noticed that too, but I think there's certain cases with complex data structures where it actually hasn't tracked. Have you seen that before?
Yeah, it's been wishy-washy for me before. And arrays are one of the biggest question marks on track.
Yeah. And the reason it is, I think, wishy-washy, and the reason we have those problems is it's really computationally intensive, especially if you're decorating like 10 to 15 or even more variables with track, especially people that don't understand what it's really doing. You're adding a lot of load on the client system, which will slow down their experience. It's very expensive to track. And if you have massive objects, like even some of Salesforce's delivered objects, like if you declare track on like a record edit form, record API info or something, that's like 6 megabytes. And how would you possibly track all the possible changes in like mutating an object that large? Since Salesforce doesn't have a lot of control over the size of variables that people are using or the number of variables that people are tracking, they write in, I'm guessing, I don't know this for sure, but I'm guessing they write in optimizations there that make it work most of the time, but they don't guarantee 100%. So if you want to guarantee 100% situation, you're dealing with complex nested objects and you want to, as the developer, control and trigger that refresh, use a clone. Use this or the object version. Right, spread syntax, however it is, within the object. I think so. Okay. Any questions about that? And we'll move on to Ben, your question here. That's a good one. No?
I just want to mention, to accomplish the reassignment, you could also leverage some of the array types, kind of built-in functions like concat and filter, because those return the new memory location as well.
And map, right? So this will trigger a refresh out of the box for you. So what Kyle's talking about is, again, these one-liners. If you're looking for a resource of what they are, what you should use, I highly recommend the Mozilla JS. You can see it's just all over my history. This is the one that has a really, really nice collection of functions and classes. I don't know where those are out of here, but I usually will look at, like, even today I was looking at the sort and seeing the mutated stuff. But they have really good examples. It's very in-depth. So highly recommend it.
Yeah, I'd recommend to anybody who finds themselves using array.forEach a lot, look into this, because 8 times out of 10, you probably should be using map, dot map, dot reduce, something, and or even dot sum, right? If you've got a list of records as objects that you get back, and you just want to see if one of them has, field _c equals true. There's 9 times out of 10, there's a JavaScript array function that will save you.
Yes, and the other thing that's really important to remember about these is they are not single one-offs. They're chainable. So like kind of what Kyle's talking about, right? If you do some sort of filter, say where a title starts with, or its header or something, right? You can chain these. So you can do really, really fun mutations across collections, right? I'm going to take, and there's reassignments going on, so it's not really a mutation, but I can take an original collection, I can filter it, I can then map it into some simpler thing, I can then sort it to finish it because that is a mutation. And you can do something like this where you've filtered, you've mapped it, and then you've sorted it all in this one thing. So Apex doesn't have this out of the box. So a lot of people take some time to get used to this concept of piping your data into different functions and then massaging it through to whatever end state that you want it to be. One of the examples, I'm trying to think, but like if you look at the delivery of, I don't have it off the top of my head, but when you use the wire method for like record type info, this returns, I'm trying to remember, get object info. I wonder if we can have like an example of the exact thing it passes in. But it returns like this big monstrous thing. And you have this list here of all the stuff that you really don't need, and then you have your actual record types. So one example of this that's classic is you get record type infos provides an array out of the box. It's a collection of, I think it's a mapped array. So what you can do with this, since it passes in an object by IDs first, so you'll see it'll look something like this. You have an object and then you have some ID linking to the actual record type and so on and so forth. So it looks like this. You can do something like this, which I absolutely love, where you would say object.values, which takes the map for the record type infos, turns it into an array, and then let's say we want to map it so that we take only, a couple of the fields. So then we create, so you return some new object, let's say with, I just want the name, then maybe the ID. Okay, and then let's say we only want to use a couple of those record types. And then suddenly you've taken this huge pipe of data and you've massaged it where you've mapped it into the only pieces that you need for your record types. You've turned it into a getter, right? So like this could be its own getter that you can use in other functions. So record type info is like so. And then whenever you're using another function, you can call this.record type infos and just get this filtered, mapped collection of record type infos just reduced down to whatever the thing is. Okay. So that's one example of using this really, really nice. Ben, your question. Can you please talk about a bit about naming conventions? In this example, you have a component named panel, but isn't that problematic as multiple apps/containers can have components named panel? Shouldn't this be named app name _ panel? So this panel was used, fancy panel. No. This is a really good question. So naming conventions, name spacing. I'm going to give you two answers, Ben. I'm going to give you the low fidelity answer, and I'm going to give you the DevOps answer that everybody is striving for, and very few orgs get to. App name panel. So the traditional way I've seen it done, Kyle, the one thing I would say, like when you're doing naming conventions, if you're namespacing, it's good to have some sort of convention indicating the separation of the namespace from the actual component itself. And you'll see like the standard when you're dealing with managed packages, which is the standard that, you'll see defaulted to a lot, is you'll see like a namespace, I think for like maps, Salesforce maps, for example, it's like this. then you have the actual object. Let's say it's like account map. And the reason they do this is you want to have a really, really unique identifier separating that beginning piece from the rest of your content. Yes, and Ben, just so you know, we do this at AIE right now to separate different areas of UI. So, for example, any generic UI components that we want to have shared across, anybody can use across the different business processes. We use this UI namespace. And so that's for things like message panels actually prefixed with that, other things like that. Screen SCRN is for all of our screening UI because we're doing background checks, which sucks. There's so much information there. But yes, absolutely, it's good to scope your stuff. So for the generic stuff, we use UI. For the derived stuff, for like a specific business process, we'll determine whatever prefix makes sense. Now that's the like low fidelity solution. The reason it's low fidelity is it's not automated. The problem with this is you're relying on every single dev every time they create a new LWC to prefix it and to know the correct prefix. And again, in a big project, if it's distributed across multiple teams, you have to essentially enforce that with rules, with procedure, and there's things that slip through, and it's hard to maintain a high quality product that way. So the DevOps solution to that is to use managed packages to actually deploy your stuff, and the managed packages automatically add in the prefixing and allow you to intermingle things, but then also, it handles all the prefixing for you. It keeps that completely abstracted away from your actual development cycles. It's hard to do well. It requires a lot of good knowledge on, DevOps. It's probably something Nate is going to be building for AIE, which, we're very grateful for. But that would be your high fidelity. Sometimes that requires like a full team to do. That's your high fidelity solution for it, where it's automated. Does that answer your question? I hope he's still here.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Yeah, what's up?
When you use one of those components as a child and parent component, then does it still have the C dash at the front, or does it have your custom namespace?
Ooh, that's a great question. It looks like this. So it still has the C.
Okay.
It looks a little funky, but it would look something like this: C-UI_message-panel.
Okay.
So unfortunately, the text highlighting doesn't really do this. The underscores don't do it any justice, but that's basically what it'll look like when you have some sort of namespace. I'm curious. I don't even think you can do double like this because it's reserved. But yeah. DevOps is a very tough job. Instead of building components, you're building orgs, and you can imagine how much nastier an org is than a component.
Crazy thing is most of Joe's blowing me away because even I helped out with address stuff for him, but I was working on back end Apex enterprise framework stuff. I probably haven't touched an LWC, for my job in months, 6 months. But yeah, it is. I mean, I'm stuck in YAML files and node scripts. But those things are important because you're doing the things that making sure tests run when a feature is being attempted to merge. But yeah, Joe runs probably our most UI heavy team.
Yeah.
You don't have to worry about concurrent GitHub runner jobs. I shelter you from that. Yeah, it's
as best you can.
That is a big problem, and just IT, development in general is you can't be a generalist, right? Because less and less about more and more until you don't really know anything about anything. But
yeah. No, I agree with you. And again, the managed packaging, it's not a golden or silver bullet. It's it requires really, really, really tight architecture. It requires dependency analysis, making sure that your features are self-contained as best as possible, things like that. And there's some cases where it's really easy to draw those lines, and it's other cases where it's really hard. And if you cross your wires, then you can end up with a worse situation because you end up with a new dependency hell and package dependencies and all these things. And you end up with a different kind of bundle of hell that's just, it's really hard to untangle. So, you know, it's something that if you're going to go managed package route, you got to go with the whole organization on board, the leadership there for it, and the understanding that's going to take months to reorganize any code into a managed package space. So one thing you can do to kind of get it along the way is to do this manual prefixing until you have really good organization. And then you start looking at like the concept of actually bringing it up to that high fidelity automated version.
And actually, so just today, I started and I was torn. I was going to put it on the Los Angeles developer group organization, like, you know, on our GitHub. So, you know, we have a YouTube channel where I'm going to post the recording of this video and shoot an email out to everybody. But we also do have our own GitHub organization, which I do try to save for, you know, like code that people go over in talks. But just started up a flashcard app that I'll put on my May the S-Force Be With You GitHub repo, but it's using second generation packaging, and it's based off of some D2X, like a new library. I can post you know, links later, but it's a great like intro to several managed packages, right? And getting experience with, yeah, how do you sort out dependencies across multiple managed packages? Because it is like that's our node import, right? Is Apex is tough like that, because it's there is no npm, right, for Apex. App Exchange is not npm, right?
It's not.
No.
And npm is hated amongst JavaScript devs, so I don't even know what to say there. Not universally, but if you read in certain forums, there's a lot of people that are frustrated with it. So it's just a hard problem in general. I think one of the hardest.
Yeah, and you know, give an example. You know, I was writing like, how do we, you know, basically make a button to increment, you know, our version tag for the repo, and like, oh, you know, look, there's a semantic versioning npm package, and there's a create tag in your GitHub repo package, and then you're importing 4 packages to write 30 lines of node, right? It's like, why are we doing this?
Yeah, that's bonkers.
Yep.
Okay, well, the last thing I do want to touch on, it's a whole different thing, and it's going to take a whole different presentation. And it's still something I think even at AIE we're getting to, and so I'm not anywhere near an expert in it, but it is really important, and that is like testing. So LWC is completely testable, and the caveat is you are using jest tests, which is a pretty well understood and well developed framework for React apps and things like that to basically test your different states of any complex components and things to make sure things are running the way they should. You don't have any code coverage for it out of the box, but it's something you can have in DevOps. But, you know, what I do want to say is that it is really, really, really important to do testing as well, right? And writing your tests. I don't want to go into it. I think we've done enough for the day, but just like as a footnote, like for another time or whatever, I'd love to do a conversation about how you test your front end components. And even like as I was writing them for AIE and like trying to figure this out, I couldn't even get like some of the jest testing to work out of the box because you can't install or run it on the corporate computers without like a bunch of manual or like privilege overrides and stuff. So it's gnarly as far as getting the whole framework together on your computer and stuff to get it to go, but it is something really good, and we think we should talk about it sometime. Kyle, hey man, great to see you. Thanks. A lot of good questions and stuff, so I appreciate it. Hope you have a good day. But yeah, thanks everybody. I really appreciate that. It was a lot of fun. Thanks, Nate, for inviting me. Any final questions or any thoughts or concerns or anything else you guys have for me? Very positive group, it seems. No one's dropping the bomb of your stuff will break in 5 days. You don't know it yet.
Yeah. One of the things I did post it in the comments or in the chat higher up, but one of the first things that I tried to use local dev server for was a chart.js thing, right?
Oh, nice.
You're like, oh, okay, yeah, you can't access the database. Oh, actually, that's something, Joe, if you can send me links to. I know you went over the data mocking and how GitHub Copilot can help with that, and it's basically JSON. Maybe we'll shoot some links to like how to do that. And you can see if you go to the LWC reference, a lot of times they'll have that, .js file that they import for data, sample data. But you can't access the database with the local dev server. Makes sense. You also cannot access static resources because they're on the server. But you can include it in a local JS file, right? I mean, with LWC, now we only have one JS file instead of controller helper, whatever that was in the Oracle. That doesn't mean you can only have one JS file in your bundle, right? You can have constants.js and data.js, whatever you want.
Oh, yeah.
But it does max out at, like 131K or something. So, that would limit you, for certain JavaScript libraries if you're trying to do local dev and include whatever, Bootstrap, I don't know. But it is possible.
The big thing about the way you design components to help with the stubbing is the component that actually does the UI and the state management and that sort of thing. You want that to be completely independent from your databasing layer.
Got it. That makes sense. Sort of like you would
data table.
enable Apex to do just the same thing. You want to finagle your LWCs to do just that.
So you have a single API for like a data array or whatever the thing is that you're sending in from like wherever, and then your component, that's like the component itself is just managing the UI state, and then you can build a stub or some sort of test container or whatever and it's exactly the same pattern as how data table works. So like data table is great because it doesn't tie to the back end at all, and it has all sorts of complex front end state management, and anybody can drop it in. They pass in the data they want, and then it's going to go ahead and display that. But you could pass in fake data, you could do whatever because of the way those components are designed.
And that's why there's so much finagling to get it from list account return value from Apex to open bracket columns and open bracket data, right? Like just put it in this format and we don't care where it came from.
And you can also you can pass in or you can expose like an API for a function too. So if you want to have some sort of function that retrieves data, you can pass in like an actual function as the like that the consumer invokes, right? So it has the await and it has the async, everything internalized, but the method for actually going out and getting the data is external to the component, and that's another way you can do it. That's a fun little trick too. Ben, for you, what I would recommend if you really want to get on top of this is let me find the repo. Base component recipes. These are, this is stuff that it's going to take you a while, but you can spin up this repo, turn on, you can turn on Lightning or the local server. Force admin default. Yeah, here we go. So like all of the original implementations for the fundamental components are here for you to read through. So even though I do recommend books, I think they're good. For me, where I've really learned and I've gotten it is when I find the source code for whatever the stuff that I'm trying to learn, and I read through it and I sit on it until I really understand what it's doing. So this repo right here, these are the base components for the Lightning app. Okay, so these are all the ones that they have that you're using. The goal is for you to understand how they wrote these, so when you write things, you have that same level of reusability, same level of testability, of stubability, all the different things that you'd want in your enterprise code. It's basically you have thousands of examples, or not thousands, but you have hundreds of, I don't even know about hundreds. You have quite a few examples here of top-notch, really good devs, front-end devs building this stuff in a generic fashion. So if you can read through this, you get this stuff, it's going to totally change the way you think about designing your LWC. You're going to think in reusability, and you're going to do this sort of stuff. Bail on Aura as fast as you can. Jump, jump, jump.
I see. Yeah, I mean, well, there are a few places where, you
can't, yeah.
using Aura. That is, if I've got a standard page layout and I want to put something on the standard page layout, not the Lightning page, right?
Yeah.
You have an Aura app that's got you have a VF page and a whatever. Or you've got like a experience theme still, right? Is an Aura component.
Yeah.
Because it
Nate, what you're talking about, like that is a good point. Containering LWC to expose to older areas of the,
quick actions,
system.
right?
Quick actions, you have to anchor it, and you have to containerize it with Aura. One of the other classic examples is the access to the Workspace API, which is I think might be coming soon to LWC.
Mm-hmm.
That Workspace API right now is currently only available in Aura. So you have to, like, if you're doing anything with like tab closing, tab navigation, stuff like that, that's going to be, you're going to be anchoring your LWC within an Aura component to get that stuff done.
Yeah.
So he's totally right.
The only time you should be using Aura nowadays, especially starting it from scratch, is if you've investigated how to do it in LWC and there is not a way, right? Because it's still not there yet.
Well, let me caution you there, because let's say you want to access like the container, like you want access to the Workspace API. What you do is you build a really, really thin Aura component that has an embedded LWC that has 90% of what you need. And then what you do is you create an event that bubbles up from the LWC component when some user-based action or whatever happens, and you dispatch it up to access the Workspace API. So that Aura component is just a really thin layer providing you access to Workspace API, embedding in any of these other things he's talking about. But 90% or as much as what you can do, you want to drop into LWC. And then, as this technology comes up to speed and matures, you can slowly pull your stuff out of Aura, and you have 90% of it done, and you don't have to refactor. That would be the only caveat.
I know the Aura, I got to a point with Aura where every single function in my controller was helper dot. It was a one-liner.
Yeah,
it was almost like a trigger handler.
Yeah. You saw that naming convention go into a lot of Apex too, and that's really not a good one.
Yeah.
The helper naming conventions, no bueno.
Yeah. All right. Everybody give a hand for our presenter, Joe.
Yeah.
Everybody's
gone. All tired.
Got our troopers here hanging in.
Yeah. This is
Very thorough. Awesome. Thank you. You had my mind blowing when we were talking about slots, because the last time I think I dealt with slots was in Visualforce. There's 2 Visualforce components that have like a slot, almost like Lightning Card, right? With its
Yeah.
title something. So thank you. I learned something that
Good. That's a rare thing, Nate. You've been in this ecosystem.
every day I learn something.
Yeah.
And tonight I was like, look at all that JS doc, and I was looking on my my work laptop. I'm like, look at that. I mean, yeah, it's not as consistent because you got to hand it off to other people. But oh my gosh, look, there's a param and function JS doc here. And, very helpful.
I found this is a little snippet of code where they do this dispatch the tab register, and then they provide a
There we
deregistration
go.
comment.
Yep. Boom. Nice.
Pretty slick.
All right, folks. I will compile all the chat, the video and the resources I've kept. Let's make sure I get that base components one. And I've got a list of resources to put in the YouTube video description, and I'll also send those out in the email once this recording gets sent to me. Download it, put it on YouTube, and shoot an email out with these resources, and it'll be in the video description.
Sweet. This was a lot of fun, Nate. Thanks.
Click like and subscribe, and see you next time, everyone. Thanks so much again.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Have a good night. Nice to meet y'all.
Bye, everyone.